All right, awesome. So I'll start us off. So Kyra and I spent the summer doing research for the Lux project. And the purpose of the Lux project is to catalog the Hetherington collection, which is owned by the university. And it was created in 2017 by Dr. Funke and Simone Opendover for a couple of different reasons. The first was a practical reason. The university has a collection of artifacts, the contents of which I'll get into in a bit. And there were several different attempts to catalog it, but nothing was up to date and accurate. So we wanted to know what was actually in this collection. The second reason was to make the collection more accessible to the wider community. Very few people have access to this collection. I certainly didn't know anything about it before I started the project. Dr. McKinnon does actually use the collection for his archaeology classes, but not everyone has the opportunity to take an archaeology course during their degree. So we wanted to learn as much as we could about these artifacts so we could post it online, post pictures, and people could, regardless of where they are, view these artifacts and get to know them. And the third reason, if you want to change the slide, was to give students a chance to have a hands-on experience in classical archaeology. As I'm sure most of you know, participating in classical digs in the middle of Canada, not the easiest thing. So we wanted an environment where students could work with real artifacts, not just doing like a research project on the idea of an Egyptian lamp, but be able to physically hold it in your hand and know that you're holding something made thousands of years ago. It's a very, very cool experience and not something you would get without this project. And it also meant that we had students from a wide variety of backgrounds that could get involved in this project. We had geography majors looking into using lasers so we could know the composition of the clay used. We had education students making worksheets for kids. We had a student who's an artist doing the Munsell coloring system so we could learn about the clay. We had another student who's just really good at photography who's taking these photos for us. So we had a very diverse group of students who were able to work on this project. And if you want to go to the next slide. So what is the Hetherington collection? So it's a collection of small artifacts, including lamps, pots, shabtis, bread molds, a lot of low value kind of mass produced items. And actually on some of the pots, we unfortunately don't have pictures, but on some of the pots, you can see where the potters kind of just pulled it off the wheel and tossed it into the kiln. So they're quickly produced, low value, but very common kind of everyday goods. And with this collection, we were working with the idea that they were all Egyptian and from about the Middle Kingdom. So the project started by cataloging the lamps in the collection, which are about palm size, they're fairly small, and have varying degrees of sophistication. We had some really, really beautiful detailed ones that even said little lamp in Greek upside down, quite ornate. And then we had another one that was just like a clay circle that was pinched in the middle that could hold oil and a wick. So wide range of sophistication here. And after we cataloged the lamps, we moved on to the slightly less enticing burial goods, so the shabtis and the small pots. If you want to change to the next slide. We were lucky enough that Dr. Ross Thomas from the British Museum kindly came and looked at our collection. And he pointed out that it was actually very likely that these artifacts weren't Egyptian. So he suggested we started looking towards Palestine and Macedonia as well as Egypt. And he also pointed out something very interesting of the pencil marks that are on a lot of these artifacts are very likely from the Egyptologist Flinders Petrie. So this gave us a new direction of research for the artifacts themselves, and also gave us a few clues as to why the university had this collection. We didn't know up until this point. So unfortunately, not long after Dr. Ross Thomas showed up, we had a global pandemic, and it shut down all of our in-person cataloging and research. Luckily, one of our students in the project, Caitlin, had been working on these really awesome worksheets. If you want to go to the next slide. She'd been working on these really awesome worksheets for teachers to use in the classroom, ranging from like grade 1 to grade 8, so a good range of ages there. So that was posted online around this time and had already been used by a variety of teachers. Kyra herself has it in her lesson plan, and there's actually a teacher all the way in Taiwan that used it in his classes. So So it's been a really awesome way to teach people about these artifacts and ancient history in general. We were also lucky enough to have a Zoom meeting in the fall with the Egyptologist, Dr. Carolyn Arbuckle-McLeod, and she was just able to answer any questions students had about Egyptian history in general. So we have this pandemic. What do we do? The problem arose that how do you catalog artifacts if you can't be in the same building? And unfortunately, the answer we kind of got to was you can't. So we had to switch our focus from cataloging into research. And we focused on two main points for this. The first that Kyra will get into was the ancient uses of each of these artifacts. And the second was the modern question of why does the university even have this collection? So I spent my summer going through digital archives, trying to learn as much as we could about why we had it. We didn't know a whole lot to start off with. We knew that it had arrived from University College London and the Egypt Exploration Fund in 1903, along with other shipments sent at the same time to a reverend in Vancouver, Victoria College, and Mount Allison in New Brunswick. Those were all sent at the same time. We also knew it was called the Hetherington Collection after Professor Albert Hetherington, but he didn't actually begin teaching at U of W, then Wesley College, until about a decade after these artifacts arrived. So we know it came from the Exploration Fund. Why did we get it? After some digging, we figured out that an individual couldn't request to be given artifacts, but they could make a donation and then nominate an institution to receive a collection of artifacts for teaching materials. So this is probably where we got it from, but who made this donation? What kind of linked Wesley College to the Egypt Exploration Fund? We know the dean of the college at the time was Joseph Sparling, but there's no record of him or Wesley College making this contribution. And if you want to change slides, so this is where Charles Curley comes into the picture. He eventually became the curator at the Royal Ontario Museum. He was from Ontario, graduated from Victoria College in the same year that Hetherington also graduated there, although different programs. Then Curley spent 2 years in Dauphin in the late 1890s, working as a missionary. Eventually he got sick and went to a hospital in Winnipeg. Winnipeg Hospital kicked him out pretty quickly. So he spent the summer recovering, staying with the dean of Wesley College, Joseph Sparling. And then in 1902, after many hours of research, I found one article from the Methodist annual meeting that had Joseph Sparling, Curley, and Hetherington all at the same event. So we know they knew each other. And around this time, Curley actually began working for Flinders Petrie and the Egypt Exploration Fund. And having read his memoir, I know that he was really big into trying to establish museums across Canada. He was quite good at it apparently too as well. So our best bet is that Curley's connection to the dean of Wesley College and Albert Hetherington is the reason we have this collection. He obviously didn't make the donation, but it's very likely that he was the link between Wesley College and the Egypt Exploration Fund, and the reason we have these artifacts. And with that, I will pass it off to Kyra, and she can tell us about the artifacts themselves.
Okay, so COVID did not stop our research. Instead, it just meant that we had to reroute our research. So Bourke and I were given the task of conducting research over the summer. As Bourke mentioned, her focus was to see why the U of W received this shipment. Alongside knowing why, we also wanted to know the significance of our objects in ancient Egypt. What were the religious connections? What purpose did our items serve in the ancient world? Well, the research began with looking at the shabtis. If you want to change the slide. And finding out the use of the shabtis were pretty easy. The Egyptian afterlife was seen as a journey, and the Egyptians believed that your afterlife would be similar to your life on Earth. Therefore, you needed to do things like harvest crops in order to be able to eat. Something that I found interesting was that Egyptians expected everyone to have to work in the afterlife, and everyone would be ruled by Osiris, the Egyptian god of the dead. The shabti served a purpose in the afterlife. They were meant to be helpers and would do work in the afterlife like tending to the fields. Shabtis could also be an indicator of wealth. Some graves only had one shopti, some graves had hundreds of shoptis. The more shoptis you had, the more free time you would have in the afterlife. And then we're going to change the slide on over. And in one of the worksheets that we did for the Lux project, it discusses this view of the afterlife being a journey and asks students what they would bring with them on their journey in the afterlife. This allows for students to understand why Egyptians would want to be buried with shoptis. After discovering a lot of information of the Egyptian afterlife, the next thing we wanted to know was what specific dynasty that our shoptis were from. Shoptis were used for thousands of years, and different dynasties had different ways of decorating and making the shoptis. The first thing that was noticed was that these shoptis were not very detailed, and they're likely made with a mold. Our shoptis were mass produced, and mass production of shoptis happened after the 12th century. Shoptis could be made to resemble certain pharaohs, but the faces on our shoptis are pretty generic, so they could represent almost any Egyptian pharaoh. And then switching to the next slide, the most similar shoptis that we found were from the Detroit Institute of Arts. And these shoptis are from around 340 to 320 BCE. And in the next slide, we're gonna show you what those look like. So we narrowed it down to our shoptis being from the 4th century. Some similarities between these shoptis and the ones that we have include that they were both made of faience. However, our shoptis are just a bit more faded. They both have the beard, the headdress, their arms are covered, and they were both likely mass produced. Every detail is important to consider, even the ones that seem minor, because shoptis having their arms crossed began after the 12th century, which is helpful in trying to identify the era of our shoptis that they belong to. For all the examination and research, it is evident that our shoptis were from the 4th century. Alongside the shoptis, the collection also has small statuettes of Osiris. So going into the next slide, and as previously mentioned, Osiris was associated with the afterlife and the Egyptian god of the dead. These statuettes, like the shoptis, were used for religious purposes. One potential religious use of these statuettes was for cult purposes. These figurines could have been made in the temple and used for ceremonies or festivals. However, I do not think that they would be used in the temple since they are mass produced, and the ones used in the temple would have been more elegant and expensive. Since they are small and portable, it is plausible that they were used for festivals. Another possibility is that they were used as votives. Some votives would be bought by wealthy families and they would donate them to the temple. However, regular Egyptians would have been able to purchase them as votive offerings. These statuettes would be used in a burial and would have been placed inside the tomb. These statuettes would have been treated with care and respect as they are an offering to a god. And looking at our statuettes, we're able to determine what time frame they would be from. Going into the next slide, we actually were able to access notes from Petrie himself. And he notes that the bronze statuettes are from the 26th dynasty. And then going into the next slide, it also shows another example of Petrie's notes. And then also the one after this one is also showing Petrie's notes. And also the use of bronze is also an indicator that the time period because bronze was the most used metal during the late period. And then the last objects that we will be discussed are all the various cups that are in the collection. Going to the next slide. Unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of them except for the large one that Kenzie is holding. And these cups were mass produced as well and could have been used for different things. One possibility is that they could have been used as offerings to the deceased. Since the afterlife was a copy of your life on earth, you would need food and water in the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians believed that the living were supposed to take care of the dead. Hence, they would bring cups full of water or food to their deceased loved ones. Some cups have been found with residue of vegetable matter to indicate that they would leave food offerings for the dead. Like the Osiris statuettes, these cups could have been used for cult purposes. Priests could have used these cups for the burning of incense or for libations. Some of the larger vessels could have been used as embalming deposits. However, this would not be for embalming a human. It would actually be used for a ritual in which Osiris, the god of the dead, is embalmed. The cups could have also just simply been used recreationally. They could have been just the ancient equivalent to a red solo cup. They could have been used to pour wine at feasts and at festivals, and this would then be associated with the rich, as they would be the only ones able to afford disposable cups. In terms of time frame, I found vessels from the 25th and 26th dynasty that were similar to ours. They also could have been from the Persian period, as the cult of the dead is associated with the Persian period. Although our research plans had changed, we were able to gain a lot of knowledge in regard to pinpointing the purpose of our items and what area they could be from. This knowledge allowed for us to make more worksheets that parents could use while the schools were shut down. This also led to having a list of what we need to examine more closely once we are able to go back into the lab, like looking for any residue in the cups to see if they would have been offerings. These items were something that everyday Egyptian people would purchase, which is something that is unique, as most of our evidence comes from elite members of society. This remote research allowed for a better understanding of the life of an average Egyptian and how they would participate in religious activities, despite the fact that they were not elite members of society. And going on to the next slide, you may be wondering, what will the Lux project do next? Well, we have plenty of ideas for future projects in order for the collection to be reached virtually. We have discussed possibly creating a Google expedition, which is an interactive virtual field trip that can be used by teachers to help their students interact with our collection. We also still want to do more worksheets and also want to achieve our goal of digitalizing the collection. Conducting archaeological research during a pandemic is possible and allows for your mind to be open to new possibilities. And going on to the next slide, if you would like to follow our research, we do have a blog as well as a page on the University of Winnipeg website. We also have Twitter, Instagram, and that's how you can continue to see the project. The worksheets for teachers or for parents are on the University of Winnipeg website. And with that being said, we want to thank you for spending the time to listen to our presentation today.
Awesome, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Kyra and Bourke? No questions? Rina.
Yeah, so I was curious for Bourke. You mentioned how you were sort of looking through these papers. I was just wondering, how did you go about that? Like, were you having to like go through like archives and stuff, or was it more digitalized, or what was that sort of looking like?
Yeah, so the U of M has a digital archive of most, I think it was Free Press and a couple other news articles that go way, way back. And you can do keyword searches. So I searched, I think Hetherington is what I started with. Unfortunately, there's a law firm and a street called Hetherington. There's a lot of just scrolling through the ads. But yeah, it was mostly the U of M archives that I went through. And they have, I think, a couple textbooks too that I found of Hetherington that were interesting, but not quite relatable. But it's many hours of just searching through the digital archives at U of M.
And Dr. Rapat.
Hi, thanks you guys. That was really interesting. And actually I had a question for each Bourke and for Kyra. And so for Bourke, I was actually wondering about, now I can't read my own writing, but Curly, is that how you pronounce that guy's name? So Curly, the one who was working, yeah, the one who's working for the ROM, and you said he arranged for like a number of little museums, like he's very good at creating sort of small museums across the country. And so I was wondering, does that mean that the Hetherington collection is actually part of a network of sort of small university style museums? Like, are there like brothers and sisters of the Hetherington collection out there?
So interestingly, yesterday, as we were going through our final notes, we made the connection of, what were the other places here? The Reverend in Vancouver got one, Victoria College, and Mount Allison in New Brunswick, and Wesley College. They're all Methodist, or they were all Methodist universities and whatnot. And so I suspect, because we figured it out yesterday, don't have any details on it, but I suspect that was the connection of, they went through all of like the Methodist connected universities. And in his memoir, he did say he's in 1917, he was trying to get U of M to make a museum as well. And so I don't know of any official museums, but he did go to a lot of different places across the entire country, trying to get people to have essentially what we have, the collection and the artifacts and stuff. So it would make sense. I don't have any concrete evidence, but it would make a lot of sense that he was connected to that and was all kind of connected. He was quite good. He was well known for being able to get a hold of stuff. It was usually better not to ask him where, but or how ethically, but he was quite good at getting a hold of stuff, so it would make sense.
Interesting to know, eh? Like I'd like to sort of put out some feelers and see if other of these, like Mount Allison or whatever, has like somewhere in their storerooms, you know, underused artifacts that they don't know where they came from. Like, you know, it's kind of fascinating. It's sort of like it's a Canadian history then too, right? Not just an ancient history, which is really, and like a networked history actually, which is kind of fascinating. So, okay, that's, thanks. The question that I had for Kyra, actually, I was wondering about the Shabtis and, you know, them being helpers. And I was wondering, is this a euphemism for slaves?
Yes, definitely it shows how Egyptian society depended on slave labor, or it was expected that in the afterlife, if you were rich in your life on Earth, then you were going to be rich in the afterlife, because if you have 400 Shabtis, then you have technically like 400 slaves. So these Shabtis were essentially slaves because they didn't have a choice. They had to, ideally, in the afterlife, they had to work. There was no other option for them.
Well, that's really interesting, especially if they've got the faces of pharaohs, eh? Like, is there, it just seems like kind of a contradiction, or maybe it isn't, but do you have any thoughts about that? Like, you'd think in some ways like the enslaved pharaoh seems kind of like a, you know, a strange contradiction.
Yeah, that's definitely something interesting. I haven't thought about that. That's very contradictory then. Because some of them that I looked at, it was like, oh, this one's meant to be this pharaoh and this one's meant to be this pharaoh. But ours were just mass produced, so they don't resemble a pharaoh, but they do have a headdress that only a pharaoh would wear. So that's an interesting thing to think about, that they were technically slaves, but they also were meant to resemble pharaohs. And sometimes there was Shabtis that would resemble the person who was deceased. So that's also interesting as well, because they would technically be a slave because they wanted a picture of themselves in the afterlife. But yeah, I don't have a direct answer, but that's my thoughts.
I don't know, that just sounds so interesting. Anyway, thanks very much. That's the end of my questions anyway. Thanks to you guys.
So then Dr. Austin, and then Dr. Lougheed, and then Dr. Miller.
Yes, I'm going to do this is not a question but a comment thing. I just did a quick Google and I noticed that the Hetherington collection does not have a Wikipedia page, or from what I can see. So obviously thinking about things that you can do while you're not able to access the collections, and like moving forward and getting it out into the public sphere, that might be something that would be fun to do. And obviously I can help you with that if you want to, with my slight Wikipedia knowledge. So yeah, that might be a cool thing to think about, because it would certainly fulfill all the notability criteria, and you could connect it up with several different things. So I don't know if that's something that you've thought about before, but I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I would love to do that.
Yeah. And that's it. And it was a great presentation. So yeah.
Dr. Lougheed, you're next.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I really. I guess a question for each of you about the collection, and perhaps you said this and I just missed it, but what year did it arrive in?
1903.
1903. Okay.
Yeah, at the very beginning of the year, I believe.
Okay. And do we know how it was displayed?
I don't actually. I don't know if Dr. Funky knows more than I do on that one, but no idea. There's not, because I had a bit of trouble getting access to notes and stuff at the time, we don't know too much about anything once it's there. I found 2 letters, one confirming that they got it and one thanking the fund for it. But other than that, I couldn't actually find anything in the archives really about it that we didn't know. So
that's right.
No idea.
Yeah, my great grandfather was at Wesley College in 1917 to 1920, so sort of wondering if you might have seen it, but yeah, no, that's cool. So a question about the Osiris statuettes for Karras. They look like they're supposed to be stuck into something at the bottom. Is that how did that work?
That would likely for them to be just like mounted into the tomb. Ours, the ones that were on the slideshow aren't exactly what ours look like. They're pretty similar, but some of ours do have like little pegs to be put into something. But ours were pretty small. They were like probably about this big for most of the part. And they would be put in the tomb, so that the little stand I would assume would be to kind of keep it into the tomb, or if they were used in a temple.
All right, Dr. Miller.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question, but I'll just first make a comment. So on behalf of the department, I think the Lux Project volunteer students and Dr. Funky deserve a real round of applause and thanks for this work. It's really impressive. I think that students are doing this work over the summer during a pandemic, not for credit, I could go on, but it's a really impressive thing. And especially for those worksheets, which, you know, we did a news center story on last spring at as many people know, a very difficult time for universities in Manitoba. And it was, I think, pretty important to show how research in the arts and humanities can make a big difference during this difficult situation. So really kudos to all of you for your work on the project. It's really important to the department, so thank you. I'll also second Dr. Rapat's sort of idea. I think it's a great idea to sort of reach out to Mount A and to Victoria College. And I'll say, I think you could reach out yourself, but also lots of members of our department have connections to people, especially at Mount Allison and at the University of Toronto and at the ROM, if those things have ended up there. So we could certainly put you in touch with that and facilitate that kind of communication, you know, even just digitally. So then I do have a question. I've never heard of Google Expedition. So could you tell us a bit more about what that would look like and what it would entail? It sounds really exciting.
Yeah, so Google Expeditions basically is an app where you can do like a 360 photo kind of thing, where you would move and the picture would move with you. Sometimes you can do it like it's a festival or a place in the world that you can view it. You can also view it in VR, and you don't have to have a virtual headset for this. You can actually just make one out of cardboard and use your phone. So that's also cool as well, virtual reality, and also AR, which is augmented reality. And I just did a Google Expedition with my class on Wednesday, and basically with the AR, there's markers around the classroom, and then when they click on it, it pops up, and then they can zoom in, they can zoom out, they can do different things like that. And you can make your own Google Expedition. So our thoughts would be we could take pictures of the collection, have information on the Google Expedition, and then students can walk through the gallery virtually.
Cool, that sounds great. Thanks very much.
And then Marina.
Hi, you guys. Thank you for the presentation. First of all, I love the idea of creating a Wikipedia page. That's fantastic. And second of all, I was just sort of wondering, as far as getting involved with education, and especially elementary school, I was thinking, like, when I first started becoming interested in ancient history, and I think I was pretty young. I think it was from books and movies. And so I was wondering how you guys felt about the inclusion of ancient history into like elementary school programs, and if you think that has any implication for like the future of, you know, classicists, young classicists now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have the complete opposite experience. I remember vaguely learning about Egypt in grade 8, but other than that, like nothing else other than that. But yeah, with the worksheets, it definitely gets the kids thinking about it like young and, you know, actually getting involved in history. Because I feel like sometimes it feels like it's dying out, because oftentimes I students like, I hate social studies. I don't want to know about this kind of stuff. But then when we make it interactive, like the worksheets, or they see that like these objects are actually in our city, like they're here, they're like, oh, that's cool, like we actually have like a piece of history. And I'm like, yeah. So I'm hoping that, yeah, in the future we are able to reach out to even younger, because grade 4 does have curriculum of ancient Egypt, but not a lot of teachers choose to use that curriculum. And then also grade 8, as previously mentioned, has curriculum for it. But even grades 2, grade 3, we would love to reach out as well and have the kids really get involved in learning about ancient history. Yeah, I don't know if Bourke has any other comments, but.
Yeah, I think it would be really worthwhile. I remember being in grade 3 or whatnot, and our teachers built a pyramid in our classroom, and we did little name tags and hieroglyphics and stuff. And I fell in love with ancient history from that. And then the Percy Jackson books got me into that. So I'm here now essentially because I started in elementary school because my teachers thought it was cool and put a lot of effort into making it fun. So there's a difference between if you give a kid a fact sheet, they're not going to care. It's not interesting. It could be the most interesting thing in the world. They're 8, they don't care. But if you put the effort into making it interesting and making it fun, it makes a huge difference. It's 15 years later and I'm here doing a degree in it because of it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think putting the effort into getting kids involved makes a huge difference.
Awesome. That was a really awesome presentation and really awesome questions. I'm really happy that people, oh, I saw Dr. Funky raising her hand.
Can I just ask one quick question? So obviously I've been in lab with you guys a lot. What are your absolute favorites of the objects that you've worked with so far?
There's a shanty that still has like the paint and the symbols on it.
Yeah.
And I almost squealed when I saw that, and I actually had to hold it, and it still had the hieroglyphics on it. It was so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one's one of my favorites too. It has, yeah, it still has vague little marks of the hieroglyphs, which would be the book 6 of the Book of the Dead. And also there's like a Roman lamp that had a fingerprint on it still, and I remember like Dr. Funky was like, oh, like if you put your finger on it, then you just touch someone from antiquity. And so that one was also one of my favorites because it like, yeah, it was just like, wow, like this is something someone left behind, their fingerprint, and which is really cool. So